I'm going to give you a 20-minute introduction to the same introduction that I would give cadets at West Point when I would teach both my constitutional law class and my international comparative law class, and make a few comments as we go along. And the purpose of this is when we look at what is happening or the threats to our liberal constitutional democracy, this is, I think, a nice way to put it into a frame that kind of makes sense. So we'll go through the slides. I'll take about 20 minutes. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So let's get started. Okay. Our Western liberal constitutional democracy did not spring up because we sent military forces to a country, had them vote, and then left and decided that was then a democracy. Our liberal constitutional democracy took hundreds and hundreds of years, 4 great revolutions. It's a fragile thing that can easily be extinguished. Next slide. So what I want to do, I'm going to build a chart for you. And my last chart is a consolidation of everything that I've said. And if you're interested in it, I would be happy to send that single slide to anybody who would like it. So we're going to start out with the basics. Sovereignty. This may seem common sense to everybody, but the people as sovereign is not a universal. In Iran, under the Iranian constitution, and that's something I lecture about, God is sovereign, not the people. That's true in Saudi Arabia. For most of history, kings were sovereign, not the people. The people as a whole, collectively, this was the great contribution to our liberal democracy. So when you exclude people, when you exclude felons who have served their sentence, when you exclude people from voting, when you exclude immigrants who are legally here, who have become citizens, whatever, you are diminishing sovereignty. That is the basis of our liberal constitutional democracy. Next slide. Okay, so what do we do? What do the people do? We vote. Democracy is too often used as sort of a catch-all for civil rights, human rights, important things, but that's not democracy. Next slide. Democracy is simply free, fair, and open elections. It's how we constitute our government. Free, fair, and open. When you dismiss foreign, i.e. say Russian, interference on our elections, when you gerrymander districts, when you exclude people from fair representation in voting, you are diminishing democracy. Again, democracy is not the catch-all for human rights, for good government. Just look at what happened in Iraq, where they had relatively free elections, and then they left. They had no history of building up a liberal constitutional society, and when you left, the democracy falls apart. Free, fair, and open elections, and as Amartya Sen said, plus public reasoning. Next slide, please. Okay, so we elect our government through democracy. Our democracy in the West is based on constitutionalism. What's constitutionalism? Next slide. Constitutionalism is a complex subject, but if you boil it down, a government based on constitutionalism requires 2 things. The constitutional system has to give government enough power to have authority to do the things it needs to do, to provide peace, security, and individual freedom. The rule of recognition means we identify the Constitution as our source of authority. And I'm a retired military judge advocate, when I took the oath of office, I swore to support and defend the Constitution. Not the flag, which I respect, government, the Constitution. And establishing an effective chain of command. That's a military term that political scientists use. To have an effective government, You need to delegate authority. You need to fill positions in government, not with political hacks, not with people who know nothing about the department that they represent, but expert people. You let them do their jobs and you get on with it. The second thing that constitutionalism does is it constrains government authority. You want government with enough power to do the things it needs to do, but not to have so much power that it begins to oppress people. Judicial review is critical. An independent judiciary is absolutely fundamental to a liberal constitutional democracy. And I somewhat despair in looking over the past history of Supreme Court nominations and confirmations to see how it has evolved from some political issues, but respect for the person's knowledge, down to simply whether you believe in abortion or not, and that's the sole criteria as to whether you're going to get appointed. And the fact that Congress can simply not vote on a nominee until the next president comes into office, that degrades judicial independence, that degrades constitutionalism. Okay, so now we've got some pieces of the puzzle in place. So what does government that is hopefully founded on a principle of constitutionalism do? It passes laws. And in a liberal constitutional democracy, we want laws that are passed and implemented under what we call the rule of law. Next slide. So what is the rule of law? These are 2 slides. A lot of definitions of this, but we want laws that are prospective. They're not retroactive. They don't punish us for things that were not illegal when we did them. Open, clear, and stable. When an administration comes into office, and its sole purpose is to undo everything the previous administration does, you do not have stable laws. How can people plan their lives? How can government be effective when laws change every 2, 3, or 4 years just because that's the purpose? An independent judiciary with due process again. Next slide. Courts must be easily accessible. If you look at the Middle East, a subject that I lecture a lot about, and you look at Egyptian courts, for instance, if you sue somebody in Egyptian court, the average length of time to get a judgment is anywhere from 14 to 18 years. They do not have an effective judiciary. You need courts that are accessible, that operate properly with due process, and you need crime preventing agencies, the police, the FBI, that are of themselves subject to the law. Next slide. Okay, last piece of the puzzle. Civil society. If you have all of these elements in place, but you do not have an effective or functioning civil society, this can fall apart. When President Khatami of Iran became president of Iran in the late 1990s, he was voted by an overwhelming majority of the Iranian people on a platform of promoting civil society within Iran. He ultimately failed, but during his regime, you had elements of a civil society that were very hopeful for the Iranian people. So what is a civil society? Institutions, organizations, and groups outside of government that are protected by government. They support government and the rule of law. Examples, next slide. Free press, absolutely fundamental. You can really judge the health of a civil society in any country based on the freedom of the press. And when you constantly attack the press, if you constantly claim that any report is illegitimate, fake, whatever, you are denigrating a fundamental pillar of civil society. Political parties, absolutely. Organized religion. We have an establishment clause and a free exercise clause. This is one of the more religious countries in the entire world, in the entire West. But religion is promoted and flourishes in the United States because it's not controlled by government. And I can tell you based on personal experience that when the Islamic government took over in Iran, participations in mosques decreased by 80%. You denigrate religion when you make it part of government. Civic groups, and of course, clubs. Fundamental to a functioning, effective civil society. Next slide. All right, those are the pieces of the puzzle. So what's the whole purpose of this? The whole purpose is to serve the people and provide the people with really fundamentally two things: liberty, freedom, and justice. Next slide. What's liberty? One of the early slides on sovereignty, I told you what ancient liberty was, the idea of the ancient Greeks, that the people as a whole collectively had a voice in their government. That's ancient liberty. Modern liberty is defined by theorists and so forth, is that the people as individuals are free from improper governmental interference. That's the idea of modern liberty. Next slide. And justice. Public reason. I think it was Rush Limbaugh who, and now I forget her name, she was the Republican governor of New Jersey. She left the party. Todd Whitman, exactly. And I remember Rush Limbaugh saying, "It's good that she's gone. We have now purified the Republican Party." Well, I was a German studies major at Stanford as an undergraduate. I read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And the idea of purifying a political party is absolutely inconsistent and contrary to a liberal democracy. That is not what you want. And I fear for one of our political parties that it's become so rigid that voices of moderation and voices that don't go along with the mainstream, you do not then have an effective political party. Comparative focus on outcomes for communities. That's sort of a political scientist, scholar's way of saying equal protection. Everybody in society should have a voice. You cannot exclude segments of society that you need to have equal protection of the laws. Next slide. And I know you cannot read that, but that's everything I just said. That's one slide. Within my 20 minutes. I was told that if I went over 20 or 25 minutes, the stage would drop and I didn't see it. This is the slide that I would hand out. I would prepare, of course, at the beginning of each semester, a packet of materials for my cadets, my students, in both constitutional law, comparative law, and I also teach Islamic law. And this was the slide I would give them, and we would spend the first couple of sessions each semester going over this in much the same way that I've done with you. Now, my focus would be on countries in the Middle East and Europe and so forth, but also it's perfectly applicable to the United States. This is a fragile system. It does not consist of just voting. It does not consist of just a free press. It does not consist just of equal protection. It consists of all of those things. If you denigrate one or more of them, you are cutting the foundation out of our liberal democracy and you are weakening it. It's vitally important. If anybody's interested in the slide, I prepared it on my computer as a separate slide, and you can write your name down. If you'd like me to send you just this one slide just to have for show and tell at home, or whatever you would like to do. If you do write your name on the sheet of paper or your email, please do it legibly. We have a lot of bounce backs because sometimes I just can't read. But anyway, I think I did it in 22 minutes maybe. Okay.